Naomi Klein, The Shock Doctrine, The Rise of Disaster Capitalism. In The Shock Doctrine, The Rise of Disaster Capitalism, Naomi Klein examines the controversial ways governments and organizations exploit crises, whether natural or man-made, to push through divisive economic policies and seize control. Drawing on its roots in electroconvulsive therapy, ECT, and its application in political suppression, Klein traces the development of disaster capitalism through decades of global events and political decisions. The book explores the motivations of those behind these actions, as well as the repercussions on the affected populations and their consequences on a global scale.
Dr. Ewen Cameron's Dark Experiments. Dr. Ewen Cameron, with CIA funding, conducted extensive experiments with electroshock treatment that involved torture methods such as sensory deprivation and megadoses of psychedelic drugs. He believed that he could recreate a new, healthy identity when he observed his subjects becoming blank slates. However, his approach failed, and he only succeeded in breaking his patients' identities, making them confused and listless. The CIA recognized the potential of Cameron's shock therapy for information extraction and pacification, resulting in the Cubark Manual, which served as a protocol for later advanced interrogation techniques. Creating chaos for a new order. A group of economists, led by Milton Friedman and the Chicago School of Economics, embraced the idea of economic shock therapy to achieve complete free market capitalism. They believed in the maxim, "the government that governs best governs least," and saw the free market as the catalyst for democracy, stability, and peace. However, they knew it would be difficult to get societies to enact free market reforms. Therefore, they waited for opportunities such as economic crises to forcibly implement painful reforms to reshape economic policy. They also ran exchange programs between Latin American schools and the University of Chicago to convert more economists to their school of thought. Their actions were based on the belief that if enough liberalization policies were enacted swiftly and decisively, there would be no meaningful way to counteract them. The dark side of economic reforms. Governments often repress democratic rights and use violence to impose economic reforms, but who really benefits? When it comes to economic reforms, using economic shock therapy alone may not be enough to convince an unwilling public to comply. Therefore, governments may resort to more extreme measures, such as repressing democratic rights and using violence. The book provides examples such as the interim government implemented in Iraq, which cancelled elections because emerging political powers were not willing to privatize their oil industry. Another instance is the ban on freedom of assembly and political dissent in South America's southern cone, where state brutality extended into human rights violations. Such violence was not just crude brutishness but planned terror, designed to force the population to comply. Up to 150,000 people were made to suffer in prisons specifically designed to break their will. These examples show that economic shock therapy is often insufficient in itself to implement reforms, and many governments turn to state repression and violence to augment it. But who benefits from these reforms? The book challenges the notion that economic reforms benefit everyone and suggests that clear winners and losers exist. Economic shock therapy, for the few, at the cost of the many. Economic shock therapy policy measures implemented in an economy bring about winners and losers. But, generally, the biggest losers are the average citizens of the country. Pinochet's Chile, for example, saw a record 30% unemployment rate and a 15% economy shrinkage after the implementation of Chicago school reforms. The long-lasting effects of these policies are prevalent, with Chile ranking as the 8th most unequal country in the world in 2006. On the contrary, multinational corporations benefit from these policies as they can purchase those firms damaged by hyperinflation and a broken economy. This policy hurts the rest of the population, helping the wealthy, and Iraq's experience with privatizing their national oil industry is a suitable example. Since 95% of Iraq's government revenues came from the national oil industry, privatizing it significantly impacted the country's economy. Silencing opposition in the name of economic reforms. Economic shock therapy is often accompanied by silencing of opposition, especially ideological dissidents, to prevent any obstruction in implementing unpopular reforms. Governments motivated to crush material or ideological opposition neutralize threats of full-fledged rebellions. Dissidents critical of regimes generate discord through the public scrutiny of the reforms, making them more dangerous. Using terror as a method to silence opposition can cause the ideological debates surrounding contested reforms to fall silent, giving reform regimes complete control over political discourse, thus framing dissidents as terrorists. With no possibility for political debate, both the reforms and despots imposing them have nothing to fear. In Chile, 80% of political prisoners subjected to Pinochet's 1976 reforms were workers and peasants, while in Argentina, unionists, farmers advocating for land redistribution, and social service workers were abducted and tortured. Economic shock treatments do not directly target political dissidents but aim to prevent material or ideological obstruction to reforms. Trade liberalization and brutality. Trade liberalization policies implemented through brutality and shock therapy in the 1970s had detrimental consequences in countries like Argentina. These policies caused the privatization of state-owned companies, austerity measures, widespread unemployment, and the removal of labor protection laws. Basic necessities like bread, butter, and water had their prices deregulated, which led to hyperinflation, leaving many without food or money. The oppressive regime used fear and imagination to instill obedience and avoid resistance against unpopular economic reforms. This authoritarian approach caused widespread fear and hopelessness, leaving many too scared or defeated to act against their government. Western financial institutions and the collapse of struggling nations. This book's summary highlights how Western financial institutions contributed to the economic collapse of struggling countries, instead of helping them. In the 1980s, countries like Poland and South Korea were refused aid from the International Monetary Fund and other institutions unless they adhered to demands focused on trade liberalization, privatization, and austerity. The result was mass unemployment, plummeting wages, and struggling industries. The IMF and the US held these countries hostage by refusing aid unless they gave in to these demands, intensifying their financial problems. The actions of the Western financial institutions did not ensure global financial stability, as claimed, but rather contributed to economic turmoil. The lucrative relationship between big business and government in the Iraq Reconstruction. The Bush administration's hollow shell model for corporate organization provided an unprecedented opportunity for select companies seeking access to government dollars during the reconstruction of Iraq. This model outsourced everything other than core competencies, resulting in lucrative contracts for building, mining, and security services. Private contractors provided not only security but also carried out raids, arrests, prison security, and interrogation. The Bush administration spent $327 billion on private contracts in 2003 alone and $270 billion per year while Bush was in office. Minimal government oversight meant that corporations were not held accountable. The case of Custer Battles, who created fraudulent invoices, proves that corporations subcontracted had no legal obligation for fraudulent activities. The U.S. reconstruction of Iraq represented never-before-seen opportunities for large corporations and businesses seeking to profit from the country's instability.
Naomi Klein's The Shock Doctrine offers a sobering examination of how powerful governments and groups use crises to facilitate economic and political changes that would otherwise be unattainable. From the brutal experiments involving ECT to the manipulation of debt-stricken economies, the book sheds light on the dark side of disaster capitalism. Klein exposes the manipulation of these situations by pointing out the winners, losers, and consequences of these practices. Ultimately, she challenges readers to question the underlying motives driving such policy changes, and consider the long-term implications for the societies they impact.